We have on the stage with me three colleagues, Jaroslav, Francesco, and Jan, who will be giving the first presentation focusing on strategies of agroecological transitions. And I, for this presentation, will be exiting the stage and turning it over to the three of them, but I will return back for the presentation at the end of the presentation for questions. So Jan, over to you, and Alexandra, you can put the PowerPoint up. Thank you.
So, warm welcome also from my side. I'm happy to present main findings from the case studies, from these 15 case studies in the UNISECO project, together with my colleagues Jaroslav and Francesco, to you. And it will fit nicely, this presentation, I think, after the very interesting introduction of the policy environment by Susanna, and also the methodological introduction by Gerald into the project. And Alexandra, if you can go on the next slide. Yeah, just to pick up again, the core question or core dilemma in the UNISECO project was, and you've seen that in the video we showed, was how to produce sustainably in an environmental way while being profitable at the same time. That was kind of the core question we dealt with in all our 15 case studies. And this core question we approached from two sides, basically. We had some case studies which represented rather a weak economic farm performance, which were rather extensive systems. And on the other hand, we had case studies which were more focused on environmental issues and represented more intensive farming systems. Well, we didn't only have this diversity with respect to the core dilemmas, but also with respect to the production types we covered in these 15 case studies. So we covered from livestock systems to arable to mixed and perennial systems across whole Europe. You see that also in the session list of today. Next slide, please. Well, this diversity in our case studies made it also necessary to start with mapping the actors in each of the case studies, because of this high diversity, different actors were important within different case studies. And we approached that with creating Netmaps. You see an example of that for the Latvian case study on the right or upper side. And just to get a first idea who we need to involve in discussing strategies for agroecological transition in each of the case studies. Next slide, please. So the diversity of the case studies was also mirrored by a very broad range of practices we encountered when doing the status quo analysis in the case studies. So we encountered agroecological practices ranging from fertilizer management, like the use of organic fertilizers, to weed, pest and disease control, alternative practices there, livestock management and soil management, different practices there as well. Next slide, please. Water management, like drip irrigation in one case. Then, of course, all the crop choice related decisions, and also livestock density in some cases was at the center of the core dilemma even. And then also practices directly relating to biodiversity, like buffer and flowering strips, or also larger semi-natural habitats on farms. Next slide, please. I already mentioned this. We started the case study work basically with a status quo assessment, and we had a look how these agroecological practices we encountered in all these 15 case studies, what effect they have on the sustainability of the farming systems. For that, we use these 3 decision support tools Gerald mentioned before. So they basically, with them, we assess the sustainability of the farms, of a subset of farms we chose in each case study. And the results basically turned out as the agroecological farms, compared to their conventional counterparts in the case studies, perform better with regard to biodiversity and water quality. Also, not so surprisingly, also because of the pesticide and fertilizer use, which is reduced on that farms. But there were some more ambiguous results as well, where there wasn't a clear difference between agroecological and conventional farms, like for soil quality, where that was, of course, also a little bit tool dependent. Then other indicators played a role as well, or many practices, like, for example, determining fertilizer requirements in soil, but also the soil condition in general and the land use on the farm, which is not only dependent on the agroecological practices on that farm. And then we also saw that agroecological practices can be both increasing or decreasing greenhouse gas emissions on a farm. So also there was some ambiguity in our results. Next slide, please. Well, what is interesting, I think, from the status quo analysis was also, and now maybe connecting back also what Susanna mentioned in her introductory presentation, connecting back to the biodiversity strategy 2030 and the farm to fork strategies, that there are, even on agroecological farms, there is some room of improvement. We found among these roughly 130 farms we assessed across Europe. So we saw that there is a lack of larger semi-natural habitats on those farms we assessed, and also a lack on the targeted support for species on farms. So that relates to biodiversity, and I think there is still some room for improvement for a lot of farms, and also in relation maybe to carbon farming, which was mentioned before. We astonishingly, although we had quite some, for example, organic farms in the sample, the compost application rate was quite rare among the farms. Next slide, please. Well, we also assessed the implications. What if we would introduce new farming practices on the existing farms we assessed in the case studies? And also here we took the approach from different sides. So either we had a rather conventional farm, and there we tried to introduce more agroecological practices to improve the environmental performance, or coming from the other side, a rather extensive farm where we tried to model new practices to improve the economic performance. So you already seen that in the title, we got quite some new trade-offs we identified. But first, maybe the good news is there are also some synergies between environmental and economic performance. For example, in 2 case studies with the introduction of inter-row green cover. But there is a range, especially when introducing agroecological practices, which impact the economic performance indeed, and mainly through increased labor costs, lower yields, and and so this had an effect on the net farm income, which was lower, and confirmed a little bit the core dilemma we put at the center of the UNISECO project. Next slide, please. And now I will hand over to Jaroslav for the next slides.
So good morning also from me. As it was said before, we want to understand under what conditions the transition towards agro-ecological farming systems it's possible. So in all case studies, we identified barriers for these transitions. And also we've met with case study stakeholders and discussed and co-construct the strategies and relevant actions behind the strategies, how to address those barriers. We can't present all of them because it's quite a huge amount of information. So because you can see them in detail in the afternoon when the case studies will be presented. So here will be examples, and we group them into, the barriers and also actions. We group them in the knowledge and social capital of type, or we can call it the human and the social capital. Then farm economics and market-related topics like value-added processing and markets. And then policy design, because we realized that some policies have been discouraging farmers to transition. So next, please. So examples. In general, they've been realized the gaps in the knowledge of agro-ecological practices, market opportunities. There have been attitudes which haven't been in favor or strong tradition in conventional practices. In several case studies, there have been limited willingness to cooperate in case it was necessary. And especially for small farmers, in some case studies, we realized farmers' fatigue for any change. And we realized not so many drivers which support the transition, but in some cases, we can see the farmers could share the experience. Next, please. Another group related to farm economics and markets, of course, cost price squeeze and market changes. Some markets are not mature for goods related to agroecological farming systems. In some farmers needs investment when they start transition, so for some of them it's not easy to afford. Several other points like that. Again, not many drivers, but there have been some positive examples which farmers could follow. And we've heard in most of the cases that the demand for related goods or commodities is slowly growing, but still usually at the beginning. Next, please. Policy related, I would call it sometimes policy put not very clear signals to farmers. So when there is, for example, not enough differentiation of pillar to support, it means not tailored enough, not targeted enough. Farmers could be confused whether it's really targeted to agri-environmental or agri-ecological farming practices, for example. The same with huge bureaucracy. Farmers could join some support for those practices, but they are discouraged by high bureaucracy. And drivers, for example, we realized that when in countries and case studies where people start to be able to join, let's say, innovative contract designs like result-based payments, etc., it encouraged farmers to be interested in such practices. Next, please. As I've said, concerning actions which have been agreed with stakeholders, again, there is quite a lot of them, and we distinguish them, the actions which could be initiated and run by actors who are inside the farming system we studied, and actions which should come from outside, like changing governance environment. So just an examples. First of all, it was quite common in most case studies that actors could do a lot of activities in common, which bring a lot of, let's say, advantages in comparison if they do it alone. For example, they can share knowledge, they can attract together advisors and research, educational actors, etc. They can run a demonstration farm. The key point was that they can do together a lot to get the knowledge. Actions or strategies coming from outside was mirroring this, let's say, gaps in knowledge and sharing. So stakeholders frequently said that there should be more tailored advice provision, and advisors should be knowledgeable about the issues related to transition to agroecological farming systems. Farmers should have a much better access to advisor services, etc. Next, please. Concerning market and farm economics related themes, again, very frequently were mentioned common activities like collective processing, marketing, storage, machinery use, etc. Things which can bring added value, again, which used to be difficult to do on one farm or on small scale, and not enough power on a market. Then another point was that if farmers agree, they can more easily associate it with other actors in value chain. So the farming system become more like a broader system. They can even agree and cooperate when looking for land, for example, and many more. So the key point was, let's say, farmers can agree and challenge those barriers together. From external actions, it was again mentioned, there could be much more targeted support of collective activities or initiative in marketing, processing, etc. By the way, we realized that there is already scientific knowledge how to run those things, but it's not well spread, and people learn from scratch very frequently. Quite frequently was mentioned green public procurement, which could be implemented from, let's say, government level, which could help a lot to market goods which are associated with agroecological farming systems. Government could run promotional campaigns and help in investment which could be linked to agroecological transition. Next, please. Okay, it was not so many points which could be done from inside the farming systems we've studied, but still farmers and stakeholders agreed that there still could be a bottom-up initiatives to, let's say, to be closer to public administration, to understand them, to be able to better communicate with them. There are in several case studies they call to be they mentioned to be ready to participate on innovative contracts and be part of the monitoring and controlling policy measures. It's related to result-based payments, for example. And they could initiate participation on consultation on CAP, strategic plans, and so on. Still, they can see there is a scope for increase. Concerning external governance change, it mirrors to some extent what was mentioned, in case of the Insight initiatives. So farmers and other actors would welcome if they are invited to participate on innovative contracts, like again, result-based agri-environmental schemes. They would also welcome when agri-environmental measures are more tailored and targeting the transition to agro-ecological farming systems. Of course, all of them called for removal or at least decrease of administrative barriers. It was quite clear they've been missing invitation of all stakeholders to be partners in CAP debates, quite surprising in some countries. And they would welcome promotion of related activities like diversification, innovation, consumer awareness could be supported or by campaigns, etc. So, next, please. And I'm passing the words to Francesco.
Yes. Good morning also from my side. I will provide you in this last part of the presentation a few slides on the role of market and policy instruments we assessed as a part of the co-construction of strategy with local stakeholders. So we actually identified a short list that categorized the different instruments with local stakeholder, and then we applied a mixed method to assess with them the relevance and performance of the key tools through a multi-criteria analysis first. And then we combine this quantitative assessment with a more qualitative discussion through semi-structured interviews and workshops with the same set of stakeholders across all the case studies in order to discuss with them the role of the key market policy incentives identified in the strategies that should support the transition, as well as the governance structure needed to implement the good mix, the right mix of policies to foster transition in each case. But also we had the opportunity to discuss with stakeholders the implications for future policy and strategy. So this is the general overview of the method we use to collect information on the instruments. Next slide, please. This is just really a general overview at the aggregated level of the scores of the ranking of the multi-criteria analysis we carried out with stakeholders. So we asked them according to different types of criteria, relevance and performance criteria, to assess each market and policy instruments identified in each case study. So here, really at aggregated level, you can see different categories of instruments and the different ranking. Of course, there will be some differences according to the dilemma addressed in each case, also from the stage of transition in each case. But this was more at aggregated level, we could see some common pattern. First of all, the high importance in terms of relevance and performance of the knowledge promotion tools. So the instruments belonging to this category were considered as the most relevant ones to foster transition. And there are also several other tools that need to be emphasized. First of all, payments for investments, which play quite a great role for them, but also food policy and networking regional instruments. What was a little bit surprising that the payments for agri-environmental practices that include, for example, agri-environmental schemes, and also was not so relevant. And income and market support category, as you can see, is one of the categories with the lowest scoring. And this category includes, for example, direct payment and all the first pillar support of the common agricultural policy. And for some stakeholders, also emphasize as this kind of support could be also barriers or bottlenecks, or may really hinder the transition rather than pushing forward the transition to agroecology. So these two key messages from this general overview. First of all, the need to move from, let's say, sectoral support, agricultural support, towards a more food system support, so great emphasis on food policies. And at the same time, the need to explore and analyze and implement innovative tools. Those are the key message here. Then, of course, we have some differentiation in terms of type of instruments on different case studies. Next, please. So which are the key tools you analyzed? First of all, stakeholders agree that although the knowledge promotion category is the most important one, not only the tools belonging to these categories are relevant for the knowledge, because agroecology is a really knowledge-intensive approach. So we need different tools that combine and improve the knowledge. So we identify the challenge of creating knowledge and the practice-based payment, the payments for investment and advisory services at different level, not just farm level, also value chain actors and consumers are key tools to create the knowledge. So in many cases at the early stages of transition. Then there is an important challenge after that is the knowledge diffusion and facilitating the introduction of agroecological approaches and practices in value chains. That we can do that through certification schemes and food policy mainly. We had a lot of emphasis, for example, on rural district green public procurement, as already highlighted in previous slides, as a key tools to improve the knowledge diffusion. And the very last and important approach and challenge is build on creation and diffusion and create the capacity building of local actors. For that challenge, we need a more complex mix of tools, which include local policies, including the regional policies, but also networking instruments, able to foster collective action, peer-to-peer learning, and networking, with the overall objective of redesign the food system. So this is, of course, is a kind of simplification, which is not a clear cut amongst different cases, and you can have more details on the single instruments, I think, in the parallel sessions this afternoon, as well as on the booth, because we received lots of comments, idea on how to reshape the single instruments by the local stakeholders. So we have also of recommendations in terms of design and implementation and on the mix of tools that need to be implemented to foster the agroecological strategies in each context that could be relevant also for future policy and future strategy at several levels. Next, please. So in this very final slide, we summarize the key messages of our presentation to say which are the key elements for implementing successful transition strategy. So the data we collected on the field, all the information we collected across the 15 case studies of UNISECO, just highlight the need of improving the knowledge, farmer knowledge on the benefits of agroecological practices, but also on the economic opportunities. These are key aspects for successful transition strategies. But the needs also to go behind the farm level and find a way to stimulate the horizontal and vertical collaboration in the value chains are critical. So important aspect already emphasized is the importance to address the key barriers here. For example, the market access, the access to market for small farms, the challenge of creating added value alongside the value chain are really crucial aspects for the implementation of successful strategies. And last but not least, policy. Tailored policy support is really crucial to increase the capacity building of local actors, to address the knowledge challenge that I highlighted before, but also to create relevant agroecological networks and to strengthen the existing one, and to create new networks of interest around agroecological principles, which is really the main challenge in our view to provide and to foster agroecological transition in Europe in different contexts. Thank you very much. That's next, please. I think this was the last comment from the side.
Thank you very much. I think we have a few minutes for some questions which have come in. One of the questions was about which social sustainability implications did you assess in the farm assessment? I think maybe Jaroslav, Francesco, and Jan, you might be able to turn your videos on and join me. I'm fingers crossed that the technology supports this. So this was a question about which social sustainability implications were assessed. You're on mute, Jan, if you're trying to answer the question.
Hey, Jan, you have a muted mic.
Okay. It seems as though all of my speakers are muted at this particular point in time. Francesco, can you speak to that, or Jaroslav?
Yes, I think Ian would be the right person to address this point, but can...
Well, we could move on to another one. And maybe the technology wizards in the background could figure out how to unmute Jan. So there was another question, and there's actually some fascinating debate going on in the stage chat, which is how one makes the distinction, kind of difference between agroecological and conventional farms. As that's not a clear distinction, doesn't yet quite exist. So I don't know whether that's something that you want to pick up here, or it might be something that gets discussed in the sessions this afternoon as we talk about the case studies.
I don't think we clearly define the conventional farming systems, but basically the distinction was made on a, let's say, the extent of agroecological farming practices implemented. So it was more like a continuum from farms which didn't start implementing them, and we call them conventional, even not maybe start with precise definition, and then just watch the extent of implementation further to more practices implemented. But I'm maybe not the best person, but I think Jan should come back because it was more in his hands.
Yeah, okay. And then I think there was another observation of to what extent financing of investments is a problem. So, for example, in the Netherlands, banks do not like to finance many transitions. So I don't know, Francesco, whether you have any insight on the idea of being able to finance the financing of investments in transitions.
Yes, honestly, we did not address specifically this issue in our analysis, but we had some informal exchange with farmers that really emphasize the access to credit as a key issue for transition, especially for access to machinery and stuff like that, but also an opportunity in building networks, and for example, and sharing machinery cost through maybe formalized intermediate institution and actors such as districts, networks, collectives, cooperatives that may to some extent cover this problem and to deal with the financial institutes to cover this problem. And the issue is whether these cooperatives are oriented toward the agroecological transition or not. This is another another big problem. But in the most, let's say, successful case, we had a nice feedback on the possibility to get financed also through the rural development programs in nice machineries and inputs relevant for the transition.
Yeah, and I think this might be an interesting question for people to pick up in some of the sessions this afternoon in discussing some of the individual case studies. Lastly, there's a kind of open-ended question here, which is, can any of you comment on the topic of trust in relation to cooperation?
I can touch that because it's really big issue, and we mentioned it in our presentation that when farmers start to think about the next steps in transition, which needs to start increase cooperation, it became quite clear there have been big differences between case studies and even partner countries, where the level of trust is different, and let's say experience with successful cooperation was different. So this is one of the very key contexts which is necessary to be taken into account when thinking about the successful implementation of the strategies, because sometimes farmers have been very ambitious in planning their cooperation, but readiness sometimes very low.